was in the number 10 Logan Circle, and I was in number 15. Number 10 had also been the house for Adam Clayton Powell before, when he was in Congress. And it has been my ability to associate with him and many of the purposes that he's engaged in far beyond the business of just civil rights. They tend to trigger or categorize John Lewis as a person who was a civil rights leader. He was more than that. He was a human rights leader. He dealt with the questions of women. He dealt with the question of slavery and imposition of colonialism throughout the world. He was engaged in the peace movement. He was against the use of arms as a tool in changing of international politics. He was a broad international perspective. And it's really a disservice to him and a disservice to the American people to think of him only as a civil rights leader. He didn't just concern himself with blacks. He concerned himself with Hispanics. He concerned himself with the Asian Americans who were being discriminated against in many different forms. And what he really did was he became the conscience of the Congress for a real reason, because the conscience of the Congress was necessary to be awakened in many instances and shadows of public affairs that had been neglected for centuries. And so I think we do a disservice when we look at John as though he is relegated to just racial issues. He was much broader than that. He was a person of ideas. He was a person of ingenuity and creativity. And he brought in people who disagreed with him on many other issues around the issues that counted. And I think that one of the things we need to learn from John Lewis as an example is that we need to have a holistic approach to social change and not be as sectarian and as narrow-minded as only advocate the things that are our favorite issues. It's the other people's issues that count as much as our own issues, and we have to find a way to coalesce with their issues and our issues to make social change. That's why John Lewis is a figure that we ought to celebrate and ought to not just memorialize, but emulate in activities that we engage in political front hereafter. And I hope that will be the message that we get to the new generation. The Black Power, the Black Lives Matter people have shown some inclination to be sensitive to that broader approach to social change. They're not narrowly sectarian or doctrinaire in their ideologies. They are inclusive in the participation. They deal with gay and lesbian issues, bisexual issues. Those are not issues that Black leadership has ever dealt with in the past. But John Lewis has been a force in breaking open the barriers to think more broadly about social change. And that's why I think we really do a disservice if we just constantly celebrate him as a civil rights leader. He was more than civil rights, he was human rights. He was not a person just of doctrinaire instincts. He was a person who generated new ideas and new approaches to social change.
Great.
Wonderful.
I've invited people, if you've got a question, it's a little hard to unmute everybody at once, so just let us know if you've got a question and we'll unmute you, if you can't unmute yourself.
In John's book called Walking with the Wind, he makes reference to me, and he says that I was not of the pain and suffering school. And he's correct. My genealogy did not believe in being beaten, didn't believe in having coffee poured down your neck or cigarettes put out in your hair. It was a different kind of approach to social change. And John recognized that that was an aspect of what made me different and what helped him see a broader picture as well. So I think that when we look at John, we need to look at him with a holistic approach and not a narrow focused approach.
Mike, yeah.
Tim, I'm so proud to have you on. Thank you. One question I had, and this was a good segue. For the life of me, I still don't understand how SNCC went through those demonstrations without obvious anger or fighting back. I know the Deacons for Defense were organized about that time. Can you talk about what role they might have played along with what SNCC was doing?
Well, let's be clear. In many of the situations where SNCC was active, we were supported by the Deacons for Defense. We were supported by Blacks who had shotguns and rifles who kept the Klan off our necks. And so don't think that because we were talking our nonviolent stuff, that we didn't have backup that was armed. And certainly it also makes it important to understand that the Black community is not nonviolent. And in my judgment, it shouldn't be nonviolent. If you read the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, he says he advocates the whole business of being nonviolent in the advocacy of Black rights, but he reserved the right to use self-defense in the defense of those rights. People never mention that in the whole statement about the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln signed. He made an exception that it was legitimate to use force to protect your rights. I think the people that are now coming along understand the balance that has to be made between the use of persuasion and the use of self-protection. And I think that that's one of the things that made SNCC successful, because we had a backup of people who were prepared to defend us in the circumstances that we needed that kind of physical defense.
Anybody else? That's interesting. I mean, I didn't know anything. This is the first time I'm hearing Deacons of Defense, Mike, because I don't know whether because the movement wanted to emphasize the nonviolence and didn't want to show that part of it, but this is the first time I'm ever hearing of the Deacons of Defense. So it shows my ignorance.
Well, Stokely Carmichael, AKA Kwame Ture, there was some friction between Dr. King and him about how to go about the civil rights movement. And we saw it there, but the media likes to glamorize the nonviolent side of this thing. But the Deacons of Defense were a strong force in the South. And Tim, I don't think I could have made that trip if the Deacons weren't behind me. They were a force to be reckoned with. And I look at that as well as the Nation of Islam. When you saw Dr. King, you saw Malcolm X, it was either, hey, look, you deal with Dr. King or you deal with Malcolm X. And the powers that be understood that balance. So the media, everybody gave the attention to Dr. King for obvious reasons. But it was an interesting dynamic going on at that time. It needs to be talked about more.
Let me say that I'm very grateful to the farmers who protected Timothy while he was down there. He spent many a night hiding with Reggie Robinson in corn cribs. And farmers walked their properties with shotguns. There was a price on Timothy's head back then when he was down there, and I'm eternally grateful to those who were ready, because the Klansmen are bullies, typical bullies. They didn't want to get shot at, and they knew the farmers who had guns and would protect civil rights workers.
One of the little footnotes in history that had never been really published, but it's worth saying a word about. When Medgar Evers' funeral was held in Jackson, Mississippi, there was a confrontation between the students and the police, where the police were trying to divert the students from marching down Main Street and head them off into a different direction. And the students were insisting on having their demonstration go in the path that they wanted to pursue. Well, when that confrontation occurred, one of the youngsters who had been in our freedom school pulled my coat and told me that at that very moment that John Doerr stepped out to stop the movement of the students to go down Main Street, there were Black veterans up on the rooftops in camouflage that had long guns and were prepared to take out John Doerr because they thought he was an advocate for the police. He did not know that he was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. I went up a fire escape to up that third floor just in time before they had zeroed in their long guns on John Doerr and persuaded them that John Doerr was on our side, not on the police side. And they put down their arms and thanked me for my intervention. Can you imagine what the history of civil rights would have been if John Doerr, the Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights, had been killed by Black veterans?
Mm-hmm.
That would have been the story that would have obliterated the whole movement's exercise. That's why I say the initiative of individuals mustn't be subordinated to the divisions and the momentum of groups. And I was glad to have that opportunity to make a critical intervention that was a pivot in the course of history.
There's another question, comment.
Diane.
Tim has a Confederate flag, and when I first saw his Confederate flag, it kind of blew me away. So Tim, could you tell them about how you got that flag?
Yeah,
He's still alive to talk about it.
I had the audacity to take my Confederate Bars and Stripes flag to an event that was sponsored by the Howard alumni. They went ballistic when I came out with my Confederate flag, but I explained to them that I had snatched that flag down from Mississippi, where the students had stormed the county courthouse and taken that flag as a captive of our exercise. The fact of the matter is that in the student movement, we were not all of one mind. When John said that I was not of the pain and suffering school, it was the recognition that there were many schools of student leadership that were important. And John was important in that he bridged the connection between some of the nonviolent advocates like Diane Nash and James Bevel and many of the celebrated names in civil rights. And he was able to make sure that they never took their eyes off the prize. That it was really not the language that was offered, but the purpose for which it was offered. And so I think that when we celebrate John Lewis, we need to have a broader perspective of the man. He is not some idol of nonviolent expression and suffering because he went to jail all those times. He had a recognition that Blacks had a right to stand up for what they believed, and he was incorruptible, and nothing could be offered to him that he would accept at the expense of serving the nature and needs of the people.
I have a question. So what do you think about reparations, and what do you think John Lewis thought about reparations?
Well, I think John had a realistic appreciation that the question of reparations is inherent in the contradiction of racism in the United States. The United States owes its economic wealth and power to the labor that it was able to steal from Black people for so many hundreds of years. And the fact of the matter is that reparations is not just a abstract concept. International law recognizes that when people are deprived, they should be repaired. And then South Africa and many other places in the world, they are now taking initiatives to repair the damage that was done through tyrannical means. Reparations is the natural growth of the next step. It's not enough to say that after you've held people back, I think Lyndon Johnson even said this, that they hold people back for some 400 years and then say, now you're able to compete. when you don't have any of the resources that were stolen from you for 400 years. Reparations is just the means for making sure that you repair some of the damage. You'll never be able to repair all of the damage, but some of the damage that was done over the 400 years of slavery in the United States. And that, I think, is a fundamental thing that has to be recognized. John understood that. He was not an outspoken advocate of reparations per se, but he certainly did understand and recognize that the need for repair is as important as the business as the need for advancement.
Others? Put their hand up.
I have a question, Ruth.
Yeah, Donald. Okay, go for it.
This is a strange question, and I don't know why it stood out to me, but the work you did in the post office under the Carter administration, did that have, is that, I don't know, when I think of the post office now, I think of it as being predominantly African American. Was that the work you did? Is that what changed things? Is that what made the post office appear very Black now?
No, the post office, remember, the post office used to be one of the premier equal opportunity employers. That was up until Woodrow Wilson became president. It was Woodrow Wilson's presidency that brought the whole business of Jim Crow to the federal government as civil service. And the post office was one of the remarkable examples of that. Many Blacks who had, over the course of time, educated themselves with postal employee salaries, and then went to college, and then ultimately went into professional activities. But for the Postal Service as a foothold, they never would have had that opportunity. And the Postal Service was initially one of the few places where Blacks had a right to have equal pay. That was Postal Service was the first one to have that. And it was Woodrow Wilson in his administration that reversed that and took Blacks out of positions of supervision and put them back down into the lower ranks. So it wasn't that the revolution occurred under the Carter administration. It was really a reversal of the Woodrow Wilson administration that created the problem in the first place. Let's understand also that the Postal Service was one of the few places where Blacks could get a decent wage. And it was a stable wage. It was a wage that wasn't influenced by recessions, and it didn't have layoffs. And that was a unique situation of security for Blacks. The Carter administration was important because they focused on how the retrograde behavior of the federal civil service had gone from the Woodrow Wilson days to the early 60s, and why we had to have a revolution in the Postal Service to get it back on kilter. And that influenced many of the other parts of the civil service to do it as well. And as I mentioned, Kenneth Clark, who was obviously a key player in the desegregation of schools, he had a consulting organization that worked with us hand in glove to design the way in which the Postal Service could be revolutionized. That study and that report is still on the bookshelves of the Library of Congress. It ought to be broken out for the new Congress, and ought to be broken out so that for the people in the current administration to see that there was a effort to integrate the federal civil service long before than the current efforts.
Well, as a quick follow-up, I'm sorry, as a quick follow-up, based on that, while we are snatching down all the Confederate statues, your opinion about that, do you think we need to be snatching Woodrow Wilson's name off of different things?
Well, they shouldn't have been put on there in the first place. Woodrow Wilson is one of the worst examples of the occupant of the presidency being retrograde and leading the country backward. He had a wonderful and marvelous perspective on international issues, and he had a terrible and retrograde view on domestic issues. Woodrow Wilson is an example of the kind of schizophrenia that is employed and expressed in many circles of Black-white community, where they don't see the difference between their liberalism and their surrender to obstruction and backwardness in thinking. Woodrow Wilson, they had the Woodrow Wilson School of International Studies. Many people would not participate in going to that place because of his name being on it. He's an example of one of those chameleons who had one face that looks toward the white community and another face that looks toward the Black community.
Cliff, thank you.
Yes, I have a counselor. I have a question about voter suppression. You have a long history in fighting for voting rights. You testified before the U.S. Judiciary Committee, and now we are fighting this Shelby case. We got H.R. 1. What do you think the chances are of getting the new voting rights bill passed into law?
Well, the key thing is to change the Senate. You got the House that's ready to change it. As long as you have McConnell and those people as backups on the Republican side of the Senate, that's why you can't change it. It's the problem is in the Shelby decision is to snatch back much of the progress that we had. And Clarence Thomas voted for it. So, I mean, you know, it's not just a racial thing, it's an intelligence versus stupidity. And the recognition is that we need to have a Congress that follows through on this. So we can't do it with the House alone. We have to do it with the Senate. That's why the mobilization of people to vote. And I'm not just talking about Black people. I'm talking about people of conscience and people of intelligence have to make sure that they participate in a very vigorous way to change the Senate as a part of it, so it can be a partner for progress instead of a drain on progress. And that's what the Shelby question is all about. It's the people who have sacrificed principle for foolishness.
I have one follow-up question, if I may. What do you think of adding 2 more Supreme Court justices to the court if we win the presidency?
Well, I'm not sure that that's a safe route to go if you start manipulating the fluctuation of the numbers of the justices. I think the real thing is to really be vigorous in the process of eliminating them at the hearing stage. And also, if you have to get to a point of it's changing the court or having a social revolution, then maybe I'll agree to change the court. But I was impressed by the fact that even in this current court, with the majority being retrograde and hard and fast partisan Republicans, they voted against the president on a number of critical issues. So I think we shouldn't give up the value of logic, reason, and persuasion as an ultimate force for change. I think we need to make sure that we get intelligent people and get the full information out and get the people who understand where their interests are, as opposed to the kind of shibboleths and labels that are used to manipulate and blind the majority of people. How dare the people argue that the business of rolling back Obamacare was in the interest of Black people alone, when most of the people on Obamacare were white? How can they say that the whole question of women's rights is not at the benefit of all kinds of people in society, not just the Black women or Hispanic women? This is what we need as an educational effort. When I testified this last year before Congress, I talked about also creating a method for educating youngsters in the same way that our Teaching for Change has done. We need to revolutionize the curriculum so that the people are given to understand from public education what the real issues are. And it's more important that people understand that, and then they can make intelligent judgments. I think that the question of reaching the people with a sound educational balance between left and right ideologies is a critical part of maintaining the future progress of this country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Roxanne.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, this is Roxanne. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. I was wondering if, and sorry if you hear some dogs barking in the background. They have been silent all night until I unmuted my microphone. But I was wondering if, first off, if maybe you see some parallels in policing. I was just thinking about the film Good Trouble and, you know, the scenes on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And, you know, I flip the channel and I see the wall of moms in Portland and, you know, the attack on oftentimes peaceful protesters. It feels like maybe we haven't come as far as we thought we had. But, you know, maybe if you could share a few thoughts about policing and police reform and maybe criminal justice in general.
The opposition never sleeps, and neither can we. The reality is that the whole business of police violence has been there all the time. It's just been paved over. And they talk about union rights when they fail to recognize that union rights can be used for destructive purposes. And protecting the police by the cover of union agreements that make it impossible to get rid of corrupt police people is one of the things that we need to undertake and get abolished. We're headed in the right direction, but now we need to make sure we close the loop. It is my view that we have in this new generation of people, that's why I'm impressed by this demonstration that had many white people, many young people, many Asian people, many Hispanic people being mobilized around these issues. That has never happened before. And I think that that's a wave of change that we need to make sure it keeps on growing. And we need to enlarge upon it. I think one of the mistakes we did make in the civil rights movement, we did that Black is Beautiful thing, and we went to the point of excluding Black people, white people from participating in certain activities in civil rights. I think we did ourselves a disservice. And I think we do a disservice again if we assume that people who want law and order are against Black people necessarily. We need to understand that law and order is something that Black people have been asking for all the time. They wanted order instead of just law. And I think that we need to make sure that people make that distinction.
I see Adrian has raised a hand. Adrian, if you'd like to speak, you just unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Diane for inviting me here, and thank you, Mr. Jenkins, for this tremendous conversation. I'm at the end of Charlie Cobb's book about nonviolence in the civil rights movement, and so I'm loving it. It was so insightful to hear the dynamic between peaceful SNCC organizers and the town, the people, the locals who were armed and protecting SNCC workers. I have had the privilege to know a lot of people who were civil rights workers and movement organizers. But one thing that I don't understand, particularly I'm here in Virginia and we are trying to, in Alexandria, we're trying to bring the movement for Black Lives Policy proposals to Alexandria. And it strikes me that when I hear SNCC veterans talking about the work that you have done and the relationships that you built, like, what's the secret sauce? Like, how do you show up as a strange college student from out of town and begin building a rapport with people who had no reason to trust and had been, you know, hurt before? Like, what was actually happening to build that trust and build those relationships between the SNCC workers and the local residents, but also between these college students that are coming from all across the world and are largely in remote places in teams? Like, how did SNCC stay as a unit, not necessarily always agreeing with each other, but certainly working in concert?
Before I go to your question, I want to make sure that people appreciate that Charlie Cobb's book, to which you referred and are about to finish, is named That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. And I think that that's important because
Oh,
I don't think all the stuff in the original version. But the thing that I think we need to appreciate is that SNCC's approach, and I made reference to it in my little opening piece. SNCC's approach was fundamentally different than the NAACP and the Urban League and some of the others. We didn't go to the community with a plan and then try to impose it on the community. We went to the community and asked them, what did they want to accomplish? And then we shaped the movement around satisfying that request. Many people said we shouldn't start with lunch counters. Well, lunch counters happened to be what youngsters were concerned about. And that's why the movement started with lunch counters. I think in each instance, we need to be attentive, put our ear to the ground and hear what the people want, and then to mobilize around fulfilling those needs. I think that the fundamental issues that the people raise are the ones that should be the political issues of the day. And if we do that, we will succeed. SNCC succeeded because it listened to the people. Ella Baker, who was our then mother, taught us that one of the things that you need to do is have the movement rise from the people instead of fall down from the top. And that is where I think we've missed the ball in recent days. We have not had a people's movement that consulted the people in an honest way to shape the priorities of what should be the political agenda. I think SNCC succeeded because it had its ear to the ground. When people like Fannie Lou Hamer would tell you what they wanted, you had to listen. And it was the Fannie Lou Hamers who were the majority, not the elites with the PhDs and the other degrees. They were the people who understood what the community needed. And I think SNCC was innovative because it listened to the people first and then shaped their agenda second. It didn't come with an agenda that they were trying to sell to the people. I think we've gotten off the track on that, and I think we need to get back on that track, and I think it will increase our political power and the followership of some of the new movements we want to set.
Earl has a comment.
Jim?
Earl, you need to unmute yourself.
I can get him.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Hello?
Yes?
Somehow.
We can hear you. Earl, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I can't hear him.
I don't think he's speaking.
Earl, you've got the floor.
Oh. Tell you what, while we get Earl, where is his iPhone? Here it is.
He must not be able to hear us.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Tell you what, I'll check with Earl.
I can hear you, but y'all can't hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Now
you
we
now.
can. Now we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I had a question for Tim, actually a comment and a question, Tim. So a comment, me and my wife were medical students at Howard in the late 60s during the same time frame. We didn't really get involved in the movement, but I did go see Stokely Carmichael speak. But my question to you was about seeing what's going on in Portland these days and some of the other things about agents, provocateurs, and infiltrators to the movement. Did you experience any of that?
Oh yeah, and one of the things we made efforts to do was to talk to the Black Lives Matter people to make sure that they didn't allow these people who are provocateurs to want to come in and throw smoke bombs and burn things up and break windows, and let them be the face of the movement. One of the things we had them understand is that they needed to control the message. and not allow these people who had agendas that were alien to the movement to come and be the voice of the movement. And that's, I think, one of the mistakes that was made early on when some of the Black Lives Matter people got the microphone and started to talk in irrational ways and have the people misunderstand the objectives of the movement. I think we have to always be vigilant about people who are pretend to be in our ranks, but are really trying to subvert the objectives that we're pursuing. And that means that we have to call them out. We have to make sure that people who claim to be the spokespersons are really speaking for us instead of speaking for themselves. And that's a continuing struggle, and we have to constantly be vigilant so that people who grab the microphone don't grab the attention of the public.
And we did have that problem back in the 60s.
Yes, we did have that problem, and one of the things we had to do was to make sure that we isolated those people and made clear that they did not have the voice of our people. They had their own voice, and they were actually not serving the interest of our people. That's what we have to do. We cannot go the route of embracing everybody in a common thread and thinking that we're all going to be brotherhood and tolerate all kinds of ridiculous statements. When people say stupid things, they ought to be called stupid. And they ought not be covered because they have a skin color that looks like yours. But their skin color is not what's relevant. It's what their ideas are and the way in which they support those ideas.
Jim, did you have a comment? Jim Cohen? Yeah.
No, I was just agreeing with the ear to the ground approach. I think that's eminently sensible and what we need to do. And that's one of the big tenets of allyship.
That made me, can I say something? When I heard you say that, ear to the ground, and I was thinking about the not just the policing issues, but more the criminal justice issues, because to have the ear to the ground on criminal justice issues, in many ways you need to have your ear to people who are in prison, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. And prisons make it even harder to do that all the time. I'm dealing with a young man here in the neighborhood, and just understanding as a returning citizen what he's going through, trying to get his life back together, and all the racist policies all along the way, at every little step of the way, just to try to get back out into a life. And that's a hard ear to get to, I think. And the other piece I would just add, to have you talk about the role of social media. We cannot control the message anymore. It's very hard to control the message because there are so many ways that it's being spread. Just a comment on that.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons you have to be vigilant, and you have to reach out to groups that are not typically involved in the discussion to make sure that they understand that their silence aids and abets the improper understanding of the issues. And we need to get people who are not political per se to understand the issues as well. Get prisoners to come to groups and talk to them. Have them understand the kind of issues of the re-entry into society after one has served one's term in incarceration. Have them understand that the need for job and employment is as relevant after prison as it was before. And have them understand that there are ways in which we can address this issue and lessen the burden of people who are returning to society. I think those are dialogues that we can encourage, and we need to make more of them, not less of them.
There's a wonderful organization, let me pull in here, called the Free Minds Book Club that is active in prisons, and they have a program called Write Night, W-R-I-T-E, where they've encouraged prisoners to write poetry or prose and put it out there to the the Free Minds Book Club, and people come, we used to come and sit in a church basement or somewhere and write on their, or make comments about their writing. And the Free Minds Book Club has published some of that work now. Now there are virtual meetings of the Free Minds Book Club, right night, once a month or so. But it's a nice way of plugging people who are still in prison, and some of the graduates of the program who get out still correspond and come to the right nights and correspond with those still in prison. So it's one of the efforts, and I think there have to be many different efforts to try and reach the minds of young people who are caught in this system.
Thank you.
And teaching for change also, in going out to the schools to talk to the kids, high school kids, many of them who get trapped and, you know, don't believe in themselves, don't see what's happening to themselves. So.
Who else has a comment, question?
Amen.
Mike?
Tim, folks, Tim is a member of the Friends of the Chapel at Howard University, Rankin Memorial Chapel, so I can call him Tim. Tim, do you have any idea of that section of Representative Lewis's speech that was excluded in the 1963 march? Do you have any idea or a sense of what that might have been?
Well, it was an issue that he was talking about, using the example of Sherman's march from in Atlanta to the sea and burning things in the middle as an example of the techniques of linguistics. But it was not going to be instructive, and people like A. Philip Randolph felt that it would obscure the meaning of his message. And so they convinced him just to drop that out. And he dropped it out with no loss of content, but the loss of the incendiary and what would be vituperative reactions that would have been inspired by that language. So it was really no issue of substance. It was just a question of style and rhetoric. And so his speech didn't get altered in any substantial way whatsoever.
Yeah, George.
I just wanted to make a comment that I really appreciate you mentioning his involvement in supporting the LGBTQ community. And it's a huge loss for us because we really don't have someone of his stature or even close to it that is helping our movement. So I just want to put that out there and say thank you.
But the reality is that human rights are human rights. And that means that there's no divisions and lines, that they create race and class and geography and other kinds of artificial distinctions and barriers. And the whole business of gender and preferences for people on a personal level should not obscure their political rights to participate and be heard. And of course, John understood that, and I think that the mentality of the whole SNCC people appreciated that. And that's why we have been very much uplifted when we see this new generation of people who seemingly have gotten over that hump of having that kind of difficulty in understanding the rights of people versus the labels that people have.
Mike. Yeah.
Tim, this might be a good segue. Can you talk about Bayard Rustin, his role during the day and what he might have been like if he was still here with us?
once there was a collection of civil rights leaders in the 60s, and we were asked the question, what was the most profound piece of rhetoric that we had heard on the national scene? And they asked each of us to write it down on a piece of paper and then pass it in and see how many people agreed to the same objective or same reference of the speech. We did that and we submitted our pieces of paper. And of that 50 people in the room, there were only 2 that had the same name and the same speech. It was Bayard Rustin and I, who had the speech that Mordecai Wyatt Johnson gave on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on a youth march for integrated schools. That speech has been lost to history, but I tell you, that is part of what is missing in our discussions today. Bayard Rustin was an insightful person, and he, of course, was squeezed out of the limelight because of his commitment to gender neutrality. And he did not have the same hang-ups that some of the older people did have. And so he was marginalized, but to the damage of the movement, he was not given as much attention as some other people. But I must say that, that in later generations, there have been some other people who are gay who have been appreciated and understood and given the limelight that was not given to him. So I think progress has been made on that. And certainly Bayard, because of his, in addition to his gay rights issues, but he also was a leftist. He was a person who was identified with socialism, and he wasn't hesitant about expressing his support for socialistic ideas. So there were a combination of what we call unpopular themes in his message. But he still ranks as one of the leading intellectuals in the movement, and to this day, he is the only person who agreed with me that Mordecai Johnson's speech was the greatest speech he made.
You mentioned socialism. What do you think socialism is going to mean in this next election? How do we diffuse this as a wedge issue? How do we clarify what socialism really is? And what is Black Lives Matter going to, or can they do to clarify this, if at all?
I don't have any insights into what Black Lives Matter position is on the label of socialism. But the reality is that socialism is just used as a kind of a red flag to get certain people's anger up or juices flowing emotionally. But the fact of the matter is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a socialist. Eleanor Roosevelt was a socialist. Many of people in the history of America who were advocating ideas that the state had a responsibility to care for people who could not care for themselves, and that it had an opportunity and a necessity to not just be class-oriented in the kind of solutions and public policies that it supported. And if that is something that you want to call socialist, so be it. It's also humanistic. And it's what has got to be part of the philosophy of civilized use of public power. And I think that that is where we need to make sure that young people understand the mix between the public and the private. You know, John Stuart Mill, who is always cited as the great philosopher of rugged individualism, in his The Wealth of Nations, he also had a caveat that there were certain aspects that could not be left to market forces, like public highways, like Postal Service, like the common defense. He understood that there had to be a balance between individual rights and communal interests. And that has been lost. And people have emphasized his rugged individualism, and they've forgotten all about the writings that he gave about why you needed a postal service, why you needed national public parks, why you needed public water systems, why you needed police departments. Those are socialistic instruments of collective power to make sure that everybody is protected. We need to have an educational system that balances the truth with the imagery that people are trying to distort the truth with. And socialism is one of those things that is previously and frequently distorted.
Yeah.
So in terms of education, are we doing better with that? The young people on the street today seem to be far more comfortable with a healthier notion of public life, as might be more accurately conveyed in socialism. Are we doing better, or where are we going?
You have to understand that there are people out there who are either themselves deranged or prepared to make absurd arguments. We have a president that participates in that. And when he has that, and he makes absurd statements, and then nobody in his party will take issue with him, then you have the seeds of that kind of distortion. So there's a little hope to have a change until people come to recognize that we need better public spokespersons on public policy so that we have better public policy. And I think that we've gone through an era of stupidity in public discussion that needs to be changed at the ballot box. People need to rise up and get rid of people who do not understand the merits of social institutions and see the need for intelligent approaches to solutions to problems, and not just use labels as things to beat people over the head with without looking at the merits of what they stand for.
Right.
Hey, Brian, can I just say, I wondered, during COVID, it's been, I don't know what the plans are there's no state funeral for Representative Congressman Lewis. There's no, national memorial time that I've seen so far. Yeah. And I just wonder how you're feeling. I'm sure you would have attended such a service. Were you able to do that? How do we lament? And
I'm proud to say that I got a solicitation today to ask me to be an honorary pallbearer at the funeral service that'll be held for him in Atlanta.
Oh, wonderful.
Also important to recognize that throughout the country, there will be services for him that don't need to have any kind of special recognition, because his work is his recognition. Mm-hmm. The work of what he did and the way he mobilized people around issues of importance, that is his testimony. Mm-hmm. And I think also we need to recognize that the whole business of memorializing people is a way of putting them out of sight.
Yes.
We need to keep him in focus. Mm-hmm. We need to keep raising up the issues that he fought for and making them the topics of discussion at our community meetings and our academic sessions and our scholarly forums, so that they become part of our way of thinking. And I think that John's contribution is going to be expressed in many, many different ways that we have not yet seen. Naming buildings, naming institutions, that's one thing. Passing a piece of legislation, that's another thing. But the truth is marching on, and John is part of that truth.
Amen.
Ruth?
Yeah, Jim.
He is going to lie in state at the Capitol.
Oh, okay, good. Good to know.
There will be multiple church services, including one at Brown Chapel in Selma.
Uh-huh.
And they're going to bring him back across the Edmund Pettit Bridge.
Oh,
so
wow.
There are a number of things that are being planned and in the works I think much of it is going to be either streamed or shown on TV. So it seems to me there's at least a week-long public remembrance of John Lewis.
And I hope that the issues that he stood for are the real memorial.
That's right. I think this evening tonight, I mean, even what you shared with us helps each of us, and as a church community, figure out how we can carry that work on. So this has been part of our memorial tonight.
Women's rights, gun rights, health care, his Smithsonian Museum for African American History, all of those are monuments to his work, and they'll keep on marching on.
Amen. Amen.
I just wanted to say that he's also going to be lying in state outside on the Capitol steps so the public can come past. He'll be lying in state in the rotunda, which is invitation only for, I think, members of Congress.
The monument to John Lewis is to keep making good trouble.
That's right.
Amen. Amen. Brian?
It's kind of interesting that the film came out when it did. And I think that this film, I think this was a beautiful film. And it serves as a wonderful eulogy for John Lewis. And as I was looking at the film, one of the most powerful effects, I think, in the film was where the filmmaker put him on that chair in front of this big screen and showed him, as he said, some of the footage he'd never seen before, and got his response to that. I'm curious. I think the film was a beautiful work of art, and such works of art are much needed in the movement. I was curious, what did you like best about this film?
What I liked best was that it didn't take one single segment of his life and try to make that the whole. It understood that he was a contributor to many different facets of the American issue. And he really represented the blend of interests that are necessary to continue the work of progress. And it is important, in my view, that film really shows the breadth of the man. We tend to give people labels that are one or two lines, but he is a person who transcends particular one or two labels. The fact that he was interested in human rights, international rights, economic rights, political rights, and all of these things, and like gender rights, these are the total stew of change that he contributed to, and I think that's the important monument to me.
That's great. Anybody else have, Mike, go ahead.
Tim, in this age, most places of worship are celebrated by people like us, this generation. We had a private conversation about how to encourage the participation of young people. I'd like for you to share that with the group and expound on that a little bit more. How can we get young people back in church, back in activism through the church, or if that's possible?
I'm not sure that young people need to be back into the church as much as the church needs to be back into young people.
That's right.
Amen.
We need that are part of the sacrilege of the church that become institutionalized in the church. We need to have ways in which the music is changed to be adapted to young people's tastes. We need to have a representation of young people in the service. We need to be able to open it up and get less tied to ritual and more tied to reality. And I think that what we need is really a revolution of thinking, so that lets us understand what good can come out of Nazareth. It is not that a man came out, it was an idea that came out. We can ask the question, what good can come out of the little town that John came from, Troy, Alabama? And that's the answer to that is young people can come out, and young people who are not known today, who will be known tomorrow because of what they do. And they need to be encouraged and supported and given the kind of resources that are necessary to realize their ideas as power and engines of change in our society. That's what young people need. They need encouragement. They need invitation. They need involvement, and they need support.
You know, he told that story often about preaching to the chickens, and in all of the renditions that I heard of that, I heard the story, but I never heard what he preached. What was the message? What do you think his message to the chickens was?
Be cool. No, I think the reality is that he probably said things to the chickens that they understood better than politicians. And I think the reality is that he understood that it was the fact that he was involved in their benefit and concerned with their lives and concerned with their care. That was the message. It wasn't just the language that he used, it was the activities that he showed of support and interest in them. And that's what I think that the church needs to be able to do. It needs to be realistic, and it needs to deal with real issues of people, the suffering of people, the needs of people, the complaints of people. And that is the way in which we reach new communities.
Tim, where do you all get your courage from down in Mississippi, coming from Philadelphia and going down south? I've only been in Mississippi once. It's not one of my places of destination. So where did you all get your courage from back in the day?
Well, I think that John said it all when he said that we have to find a way in which our experience is made relevant to the needs that we perceive. And we also need to make sure that we're not intimidated by people who disagree with us. The issue is not to have everybody agree with you, it's to be forthright in support of things that you believe in, and not to be intimidated in the face of overwhelming opposition. The reality of John's life is that he represented a person with no stature or benefits or promotion or support other than his internal conviction. He was a person driven by an internal respect for life, and the importance that he gave to us is that he was able to move us to do things that we would otherwise not have done, but for his enlightenment. I think that that's really the message. The message is to be courageous enough to face whatever the opposition is and to know no fear. The enemy is fear, not the opposition.
Amen to that. Adrian, did you have another thought?
I do. Thank you. So I love history and genealogy, and one of the things that I noticed in studying Congressman Lewis's life was I'm always asking who influenced him, and I noticed there was a great picture of him as a young man standing at the March on Washington, and A. Philip Randolph is there. And so as I started looking at A. Philip Randolph, and I noticed the debate between Du Bois and Randolph, particularly coming out of Reconstruction, I'm wondering how, and maybe like, how did Randolph become such a tremendous influence on the movement, and yet today what you hear is more along the lines of that talented 10th type of approach to activism? Like, where did the switch happen?
afraid I don't have a response to that. I don't know where it happened, but I think it's safe to say that it never fully disappeared at any one time. The talented 10th has always been an approach. The leadership is from the top, but that's why I think a movement like SNCC is important and Black Lives Matter is important, because it's leadership from the bottom. And one of the things that I think we brought to the whole scene was an innovation that hadn't been there with NAACP and the Urban League and other organizations. It was a recognition that little people counted. And we had to pay attention to little people and let them shape the priorities that ought to be provided by the institutions. And that's what still, I think, the core message that John represented. He was a person whose ear was attentive to little people. And he thought their significance was not dependent on their bank accounts, on their prestige, or the degrees behind their names, or the size of their houses or bankrolls, but it was because of their ideas that they should be heard. And that's what I think we need to do.
Do you have a preference for a new name for the Washington Football Club?
Never again.
That'll do. Any other thoughts, any comments, questions? Mike.
I just wanted to share my little John Lewis story, a sign of his humility. I was at the People's Store, Costco in Northeast DC, about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was in the aisle picking up some food. I was the only one there. And I happened to look up, and here comes John Lewis. I couldn't think of anything intelligent or anything provocative to say, except for, "What are you doing here?" And he looked at me and asked, "What are you doing here?" Just shut me up. But no entourage, no one pushing his cart. He was there by himself. Just blew me away.
Was he eating healthy? He wasn't buying chips and soda, was he?
He was a little heavier back in those days, but he looked good. He looked good.
There you go. That's good. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Like the primordial question, what good can come out of Nazareth? What good can come out of Troy?
Amen.
John Lewis is the answer to that question.
Amen. Mr. Jenkins,
there's a
you
question
have
in the chat about the pins that he's wearing. Heather's asking, she's curious about what Mr. Jenkins' pins represent.
Oh, they're SNCC buttons. They're given out at various ceremonial occasions when we have met at our 25th anniversary, our 50th anniversary, and we were to have our 70th, but for the 60th, but our coronavirus interfered with us being able to have it. So we put it off to 1 year, but we'll have another pin then. And it's two hands clasping, a black hand and a white hand. We had arguments about whether the white hand or the black hand should be on top, but we resolved those by having different ones for different times.
Any other thoughts? Mr. Jenkins, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your sermon. I think you've got a sermon here. What good comes out of Nazareth and Troy?
Thanks, Tim.
Wonderful
Thank
evening.
you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Loretta.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
It's wonderful.
Very insightful.
We've recorded this discussion and we'll post it on our YouTube page.
Great.
Fabulous.
Right.
Wow. Thank you. Hey, Adrian Fikes.
Hey, Diane.
Okay.
Bye now.
Okay. Ruth, do we need to stop recording this
We
to save it?
can.
Well, to save it.
Just leave it and just make sure when you leave the meeting not to leave your computer on.
Right.
Okay.
I don't know.
I was gonna just take us off.
All right. Hey, everybody.
Want to leave the meeting.
Yeah, it's over.
We're over. You can just leave anytime you want. You can. There's a place that should say leave on your screen somewhere.
And
Hi, Loretta.
Hi.
Hi, Loretta. It's B. Leeson. And you have to hit one more time.
Hey, Bob and Jean. Bye-bye.
Kristen.
All right.
Okay. Let's see.
Maybe they want to speak to each other, but I'm going to leave the meeting.
Absolutely. I'm going to stay right here. Any other thoughts? You've got a great library, Loretta.
Yeah, and it's well read.
That's great.
And Sterling. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, you got voice there now. And thanks, Brian, for arranging all of this.
Absolutely. Our great pleasure. And thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. We made it through
You did.
Zoom, this Zoom box that we're all living in these days.
Actually, you know, it does have some advantages, and we found that out through the Friends of the Chapel. There are so many people who joined the Zoom meetings we've had that couldn't come to campus for chapel.
Right.
And we've seen people, you know, friends who have joined from the West Coast and from Florida.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it has advantages.
It sure does. That's the great thing about that.
And when it comes back, when we come back and we can greet each other, we should keep.
We'll still be doing it, right? It'll be a hybrid thing.
I think so, because it's kind of important to get those far afield people like Sterling in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
That's terrific. I only wish I'd bought stock back in March.
Oh, and Zoom, yeah, right.
They went overnight from 10 million users to 150 million users.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
It sure is. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
And
you be well, and hope to do this again sometime soon.
okay.
Terrific. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Okay. So I can end the session. And it's still recording. End meeting for all.